Tom Davis waited 4 months for his licence. Tom lives in Devon and relies on his FAC for his job, venison supplier at Dartmoor Deer Services. He says the delay was frustrating, but it's even worse for his father, who's been waiting for more than a year for his licence.
With my licence, it's my business, and I spoke to a few other officers and they said it's supposed to be a 1 week fast track turnaround for business people with firearms. But yeah, no, it took near 4 months, and obviously being what I do, I need bullets. And yeah, without the licence you can't buy bullets. I got sent a permit which that lapsed, so they had to send me another permit, but the only thing you can do with a permit is it allows you to hold your guns. You can't purchase any ammunition or anything. In my dad's firearms, that's been in, well, it's at least 12 months, I know that. Yeah, he's constantly chasing, it's not a business for him, it's just his firearms licence. Yeah, he's constantly chasing and phoning at, yeah, he just gets told the same thing, we'll look into it, which seems to be the answer everyone gets, I think. They haven't offered him a permit or anything, so he can keep his guns, so his guns are in storage at an RFD, and it's costing him, every month it costs him to store his rifles.
Bass says the failure of firearms licensing departments to prioritise resources is having a significant impact on both participation of shooting sports and the gun trade in England and Wales. Dozens of firearms departments across the two countries are beset with significant delays and backlogs. Bass says the latest Home Office statistics reveal 18 police forces are taking more than 100 days to turn around applications, with some accepting that it can take up to a year to process. The statistics showed that on the 31st of March 2022, just under 540,000 people in England and Wales held a firearms and/or a shotgun certificate, 8% down from 590,000 2 years earlier.
The most concerning thing, and I went back to the figures from 2019 to 2020, as that's the last year, if you like, before COVID and lockdowns and all the various problems that firearms licensing departments have had. And the really worrying thing is you've got a loss of something like 8% in the total number of firearms and shotgun certificate holders in the UK. And that represents, I think, somewhere around about 47,000 less certificate holders. And I think for any organisation or anyone who's interested in shooting, that's a worrying figure.
Demand for shooting is there, the bureaucracy is not, and delays are affecting the next generation of shooters. Bask is also concerned about the effect of the delays on people who need guns for work or sport. It wants police to realise there's a cost for public safety.
We want young blood coming into the sport and replacing people who are leaving. So we have that loss. But I think it reflects a lot of people who are interested in shooting who haven't been able to pursue that hobby. More worryingly, you do have people who actually need a firearm certificate or a shotgun certificate as part of their job. Some of those are struggling to get certificates, although in fairness most forces do try and prioritise that. But there's also a knock-on effect on the gun trade. When I speak to the chair of the Gun Trade Association, he says that his members are quite seriously affected, because the people who are likely, and I'm in the same position myself, the people who are most likely to spend money on new guns and new equipment are people who are coming into the sport. And the gun trade industry is being deprived of those new shooters.
The Gun Trade Association says the issue is causing problems for its members, with small dealers, which have limited turnover and small margins, under real pressure. Bask fears it could cause long-term damage to the industry too.
With some, it could potentially be ruinous, but to all, it's not a good position. And when you put it in with that, and it's a cliche, the perfect storm, but when you combine it with all the other pressures that all businesses are under at the moment in terms of heating, lighting, energy costs, just general inflation, shortage of supplies, ammunition components, all that. So it's just all come at a very bad time, and makes it difficult for them to weather.
Bass says the drop in the number of certificate holders is down to the failures of the system in some areas. One member in the Devon and Cornwall area said he had a 2.5-year wait for a certificate.
I think there's little doubt that there is a major impact as a result of firearms licensing departments being under pressure. I've just finished a report which is in its hopefully final draft looking at firearms licensing departments within England and Wales, and that does show unfortunately a considerable number that are struggling particularly with grants, and perhaps not surprisingly they have prioritised renewals, which is to be welcomed, but it is at the detriment of grants. So I think the worst case we have is someone who's taken over 2 years to get a grant, but I think delays of 6 months to a year are not uncommon. So I think that is a major contributing factor. Unfortunately, I also think that the introduction of the statutory guidance and the more stringent medical provisions, there are some older shooters who are looking at it now and saying, do you know what, I really don't want to be bothered with the effort of doing this, and obviously that's a great shame as well.
There are huge differences of firearms licensing at the 43 police forces in England and Wales.
There is a postcode lottery. If you're living in one force area, you can potentially get a grant in 6 weeks. If you're living in another force area, that grant could take 6 months to a year. And I don't think that's an acceptable situation. There are a number of forces which have managed to still continue with their renewals. They're still issuing grants. In fact, I was actually at a force a couple of weeks back, taking part in some training with them, North Yorkshire, and they have no backlogs in terms of both renewals and grant applications. The question it begs is, if one force can achieve it, well, it's actually more than one, there are probably a dozen forces which have achieved that, why can't the rest of the forces achieve that? Also in Police Scotland, I had a meeting last week when Police Scotland were involved, and they were saying they have no real delays in terms of renewals and grants. So you have to look north of the border and say, well, what are they doing in their system, which is clearly been successful when we're struggling so much south of the border.
Bass says the forces that are struggling should learn from the ones which are proving more efficient.
I don't think it's political, and I don't think it's entirely money. I think some places, some departments, yes, that there may well be resourcing issues, but I also think the actual approaches that are being taken by firearms licensing departments, their policies, the way they manage risk, these things all have quite an effect. And again, you know, I have spoken to some of the more efficient and effective departments, and you know, they will say they've not got there by accident, that they're achieving what they're achieving because they've looked long and hard at where they can streamline the processes and where they can be as effective as possible. And I think it's for PCCs in particular who are holding chief constables to account to say, why aren't we achieving that in our force if they're not achieving it?
Bask is calling on the chief constables and police and crime commissioners of the failing forces to act immediately. Martin's also taking his concerns to the new Minister for Policing.
And my report ultimately will go to all chief constables, it will go to all PCCs, and we are certainly applying pressure there. We're also calling on MPs to work with their PCC colleagues and to actually prioritise this and hold chief constables to account for a service for which you can go nowhere else.
Tom Davies says shooters want the police to address the situation.
For what happened to me, if it's your business, and they knew, you know, a few of them know who I am up there, so they knew it was my business. I think if it's like your livelihood, you know, something could be done there maybe, you know, just to keep them going.